Well, welcome back to the Anchorage podcast. We are here on the front lawn at the Anchorage camp and sharing some more of the history and how God has worked in our history to bring us to what we are today. And I was thinking about as we sit here and enjoy the beautiful scenery, we enjoy these buildings and all, it's a reminder that we would say these are good days, but they weren't always good days. There were hard days. And part of that, I guess, goes back to the time period, really kind of your transition when you transitioned in. You started in '79.
Yes.
What what were some of the things that were the real challenges at the point of that transition?
Well, but other than just the normal natural challenge of being young and dumb, the uh, some of the things that I was mentioning in some of the previous podcasts is that the history, it was begun with a lot of zeal, not a lot of knowledge, and there was a stability lacking. I think we went through 5 or 6 directors in the first 7 years or 6 years, and so it was some things that were not foreseen for sure. Um, there was a lot of faith that was involved, a lot of zeal, and you cannot possibly diminish that. The men that started this work and then continued mostly by my dad and my family, I think it changed hands to primarily a family operation in 1975, if I remember correctly on those dates. You cannot diminish the fact that they absolutely were convinced that this was a ministry that had to go. There were other men around them at the time, but this was a ministry that had to go. Some of our longest supporters, Grace Baptist down in Wilmington and some others like that, have been involved since the very, very earliest days and were absolutely convinced that this was a ministry that needed to function. Because of that, and knowing the times that were going on there, the 70s was just a weird time. Things had changed so dramatically during the late 60s, socially, and just the way the world worked. Vietnam had come to a close in 1975, and so there was going to be a influx of GIs, military personnel similar to after World War II, and Korea, that were going to be incorporated into the society, having families and such. There was a lot of success in Christian ministry back in that point in time. Christian school movement was underway and really gathering steam. For example, the school that I went to, my dad was instrumental in starting that school as well. In 1963, it began with 40 some students. By 1972, it was over 1,200 students.
Wow.
And so um, having successful Christian ministries quickly was not out of the picture. Churches were growing, especially independent Baptist churches. There was all kinds of, now whether they should have been growing the way they were or not, that's a whole different discussion. That's not here for me to discuss at this point in time. But the fact that churches were growing, Sunday schools were growing, ministry outreaches were growing, camps were growing, people were looking for answers they didn't have and couldn't find in the 60s. So there was every reasonable expectation that another camp with a unique perspective and a unique facility was going to be successful quickly. However, it was started, as we have mentioned before, it was started with no money. And it takes money to run a camp. I don't know how much we thought about it, but camp is not cheap at any stretch of the imagination. Even some of the things we're doing now, I've never in my mind thought about 30 years ago spending that kind of money just for certain activities and such. But things have changed, and so it was a new generation, and nobody really understood where it was going to go. And at the point in time, the money to develop the facility, I think we mentioned that the facility needed a tremendous amount of work, physical work, roofs and siding. I remember we put siding on this building in 1974. It was the first building in Lake Waccamaw with vinyl siding on it. Vinyl siding was a new and exciting experience. Nobody knew if it worked or how it worked. So those were times that were coming up, but you needed money to do that. Without a good base of support and without a stability factor of a directorship with that vision had changed 2 or 3 times. The easy thing to do was to borrow money, and that's exactly what we did. We borrowed capital. It's a terrible idea, but it's the way the door is open. Other ministries had done it successfully, and so this was the reasonable expectation was going to be that the ministry would grow quickly, be able to pay for itself or pay itself along the way, and so there was that concept. And so by the time that I became involved in 1979, uh, the camp was well into debt, and yet there was no real solid forward movement um, to see it grow and prosper and develop into a self-sustaining organization. And that is what got us into some of the hardship of the 1980s, which was my first decade. Newly married, kids, um, committed to a work, but with very little resources to work with, and so it was. It led to some very difficult times. They are mostly financial, but financial has a tendency to bleed into all sorts of other areas. Um, the commitment factor, I don't think. I try not to be too judgmental on people that made decisions, uh, and whatever advice they gave at that point in time. I was a young guy; I didn't know what was going on. I was still in college when most of these decisions were made, so I had very little to do with it. Except that I do know that my dad particularly was so convinced that the ministry was of the Lord, and his commitment was to it 100%. We had, of course, I think I mentioned one of the earlier podcasts that we had purchased a house in '72 down here at the lake. We wind up looking like we were going to be moving down here to the lake in 1975. His dad left his pastorate and went to work with North Carolina Association of Christian Schools full time. And so we built another house for my grandma. And so we had 2 houses here at the lake. And yet, when it came time to do some financing, they were used as collateral to, as well as the camp property for the loans that were taken out to develop. And so, to say that the commitment for this ministry largely rests on someone that's willing to put it all in. I can remember to this very day, I was at a meeting in I think it was out at Camp Ironwood some years ago with Walt Brock. They started Ironwood about the same time, 1972, if I remember correctly, and with some difficulties there as well. There are very few things that get started without difficulty. But I remember him exonerating, not exonerating, exhorting is probably a better word. The rest of us camp directors, after we had talked about all the different methodology and such, what had been successful, what happened, and he just brought us back down. He says, "Hey guys, it's the Lord's work. Don't be afraid to give it all." And I'm looking back on that, going, "Okay, these are people that were all in on a ministry." And it certainly set me up as I was coming into it in 1979 and following, establishing a family and establishing a position that either all in or you're simply in the way. And even though that's a little cliche at times, and I understand that there's balance in everything, that certainly is the way I had to approach that time of transition, moving in to the hands-on experience of camp, and then taking it into the very difficult days that followed back up in the 80s and 90s until the Lord opened up some doors of ministry that I had not even foreseen at that point in time. So it was a difficult transition. I was committed to it only because I didn't want to teach, and my degree was in teaching. And so I wasn't married. I could take I think I was promised $80 a week, maybe, if for a salary, and I rarely got that, but it was a good start, and the Lord just kept it on my heart and would not allow me to look at anything else realistically. And I look back on it going, it was definitely of the Lord. I'm not sure that I would have have chosen that path if it wasn't for the Lord, but the Lord used it and has brought about what I would like to think is a ministry that has had effect on many young people, many adults, and on the cause of Christ as a whole in a very positive way as he intended when he established it.
From those days, as the difficulty that you had there, kind of how did it begin to make the turn? What were some key things?
Well, the big issue in the early '80s, and again, this is again, I was young and dumb, didn't know what to do, but we were not able to keep up with our debt, and we wound up in um, foreclosure, for lack of a better term. It was a long, drawn out process. And at the time, we didn't know exactly what the end of it looked like. We could look for other sources of um, income so we could get ourselves out of debt and move ourselves forward. The Lord didn't open up those doors, and so it was very difficult to plan long term. And certainly there was no cash flow of any sort that allowed you to cast a vision and fulfill it even slowly, a piece at a time. The facility was taking way huge amounts of money. Built in 1927, not done well. It was built again for the purpose of just basically being a private club and a drinking spot for folks back in those days, and so it was not well done. Certainly had to have a lot of adjustments um, for being able to be used as a camp. And then what we didn't understand is that ministry was not going to be successful, wasn't going to be self-sustaining. The promotional ideas of it, the idea of developing a philosophy that was going to be unique to the operation and marketable as well. I don't like to use the word marketability, but that's a fact of life. And so it was slow, and cash flow was always a problem. You could not bring on the staff that you needed. We couldn't pay the staff that we had, which is basically me. And so bringing on staff and giving them any type of reality, salary wise, and taking care of them financially at any level was not it. So everything had to rest on one person. And that one person was just recently married and having kids and trying to do everything. And so it was hard. And then not being able to look forward to another year, going, okay, are we still going to be in existence in a year? And if so, what's our program going to look like? And so um, it was difficult days, but never at one time did I ever doubt. I remember Jeannie talking to me about this. She going, what are we thinking about our future? I'm like, well, the Lord has called me here. There's no question about it, and He has not called me to anywhere else to leave. I'm not. I purposely made up my mind then, after some study in Scripture about some the way that this worked, that I wasn't going to make life-changing decisions based on financial income, or what was good for me financially. That's not the way I was going to make any decisions. It hadn't worked out well for anybody in Scripture. I didn't think they were going to work out well for me. The Lord used it, and so I never felt that the Lord was directing me away from it. Although there was many a day and many a night I had to sit down and look and go, okay, are we sure that we know what we're doing? But working through it, and the Lord was responding. People were being saved. Lives are being changed. There's still dozens. I just saw on Facebook here in the last day or two, folks that were involved back in 78, 79, that era, 80, and they're referencing, after going through, I guess, some old pictures in their house or whatever else, were referencing that this was the place that had made such a difference in their family, being saved here, and some of their kids had gotten saved here later on, and that the Lord used it definitely in those lives. And I've seen that many, many, many times, and I didn't even realize what was happening at the time. But I'm going, okay, the Lord had a plan here. I wish I'd seen it. I wish I could have seen it, at the time I was going through it. But looking back on it, the Lord led every step of the way. Did we make mistakes? Plenty. But that's not the Lord's fault. That's our fault. And but the Lord kept us from fatal harm, I guess, as the ministry goes, and has established what we have here today. And looking forward to another generation of reaching young people, adults, and families, and helping churches with their ministry as it comes before us.
And in the midst of those needs and struggles, the Lord was faithful.
Always.
He brought friends. He brought people that helped out in the midst of that.
Absolutely.
To supply needs that you really couldn't imagine.
Sometimes
probably couldn't even explain why or how this came about. But
I really learned what it meant when in the book of Esther, Mordecai is talking to Esther as she's making her decision. So who knows what thou art brought to the kingdom for such a time as this? The Lord raised up more people who I didn't know, had no reason to be involved in this ministry, and they brought them in. They served whatever purpose the Lord had for them, and many of them wound up moving on to other interests. But I look back on it and go, for such a time as this. And there's just, I've probably forgotten more than I can remember of how many times the Lord just raised up the right person at the right time. Many times for finances, many times with advice and counsel, many times with just an effort that we didn't have between us. The first air conditioning that we did was a church that I'd never even heard of was changing out their air conditioning, and they're like, the air conditioners we have are still used. If a guy in my church would come down and put them in for you if you desired. And I was like, air conditioning? I like it. And we started that off. That was, I think, in 1987, if I remember correctly. To this very day, I don't remember the guy's name. I don't even know if the church is still in existence. The air conditioners lasted for a very long time, and it started us down a path, and people could see a path we were going down that was absolutely necessary at that time. And I'm going, okay, the Lord had this plan all along and brought people in for such a time as this. And I've tried not to forget that. And certainly, if there's a testimony of the Lord being faithful to what He's called, whether we understand it or not, I, as a family and as an individual, I can certainly testify to that. And as an organization, I think the organization can testify to that as well.
Maybe next time, maybe on another occasion, we can share a little bit more about how we came to have the other side of the property.
Indeed, we will. We'll talk about the 80s and the late 80s when things really moved to a whole different sphere. It's a great story. And again, if we come back from the story without understanding, okay, the Lord just did a miraculous thing here, then you missed the point entirely.
If you had one summary thing that you would say you take away from that time period, struggles, finances, youthful ignorance, what would be the one lesson you say this is still impacting me today?
Well, number one, I think, is that you can actually trust the Lord. If it's clear in His Word and it's clear through His Spirit, through His Word, you can trust it. What He started, He'll finish. So you can absolutely trust the Lord on that, no question about it. The second thing is, don't be afraid to give it all. I think, again, I probably the One of the most impactful moments in my life was, as I think I talked earlier, about watching the movie Sheffy, and when Sheffy said, "When my Lord requires so much," and it was basically everything that he loved and held dear, and the answer, of course, was yes. And I'm thinking, yeah, the Lord requires that of us, the disciples, but you can trust Him with it.
Mm.
And so um, that has sustained me and sustained many others like me for many, many, many years. That you actually can trust the Lord to do what He says He's going to do through His Word.
I think it goes along with the keychain I got after our last tweakage gathering, and on there the reminder, stewards, that we're not owners, and to be faithful with what God's trusted. We're really just trusting Him with what He's entrusted us with.
Indeed.
Well, that wraps up our podcast for this week, and I hope it's been encouragement to you to continue trusting the Lord and believing the Lord can do great things, and that He will be faithful in all that He's promised. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Anchorage podcast. If you would like to learn more about the Anchorage Christian Camp, visit our website, anchoragecamp.org. If you have questions or podcast suggestions, please email info@anchoragecamp.org. May God be glorified. Hebrews 6:19, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil.